I remember going before one judge in a conference and telling this heavy-duty New York lawyer, just don't say anything, just to be quiet. And right in the middle of the discussion, he says, well, in New York, this is how we do it. And of course, the judge went nuts. Went through 2 firm splits. Those are painful. I said, hey, Bert, the danger of this split is that it lingers. It shouldn't be a battle between me and you. It should be a battle between who you select and who I select. I got to law school in 1968. I had worked out of Senator Inouye's office. What was happening in the late 50s and into the 60s was economic power and political power started to divert, and that left a huge opening in the law firm market. My association with the senator and Governor Ariyoshi and a bunch of other people who came from that era was valuable to companies. When you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? If you see a lawyer or if you see an executive, retirement is going to be very difficult. You got to see something that goes beyond yourself in retirement. I wish I had spent more time with my children. In the early days, it would be unusual for me to be home before 10 o'clock at night. So they're sleeping already. You see them in the morning a little bit, and that's not enough. Fortunately, my wife is a great mother, so she handled that really well.
Greater Good Radio, connect, learn, heal, and grow, is brought to you by Brain Gain Hawaii, a boutique executive recruiting, career development, and coaching firm. Learn more at braingainhi.com. Welcome to Greater Good Radio. Today's guest is Jeff Watanabe, who is semi-retired. What does that mean, semi-retired?
Yeah, my children think I'm flunking retirement, actually, but it's just changing life. You're changing what's going on in your life. So I'm no longer in the position of trying to be successful in business, at least. So I still stay active. I still sit on a couple of private company boards and a couple of fairly good-sized nonprofits.
Which ones are they?
The nonprofits, I just got off of the Sesame Street board after 41 years.
Wow.
That was a real kicker. And I chaired for many years the Consuelo Foundation, which does work here as well in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So those are the two that take up most of my time, that used to take up most of my time. And Consuelo Foundation is probably the primary one now that I'm off of Sesame.
Okay. And then how about the for-profit company boards?
Yeah, I sit on a couple. The newspaper, Oahu Publications, which has almost all of the dailies in Hawaii, as well as a magazine company and midweek. And I also sit on the board of an insurance company that is owned by Tokyo Marine, which is a large Japanese insurer, first insurance company of Hawaii. So those kind of keep me busy.
So maybe in a nutshell, because for anyone who doesn't know your giant career, what would you say you did?
Most of my life has been driven by relationships and trying to understand differences between people and environments. Effectively, my job was trying to be a cultural translator, actually. So most of my career was spent building up a law firm, but a lot of people do that. What ended up happening is I started sitting on a lot of public company boards and actually chaired Hawaiian Electric Industries for a long time. So my life changed from being a lawyer to being a board director. And a lot of my business was, in fact, trying to do those kinds of cultural translating. My professional career in law was driven really by serving outside capital. Hawaii is a capital poor state, so we have people who bring in capital. Most of them are pretty smart, and most of them realize that Hawaii is different than most places. And most of them realize that in addition to a lawyer, they needed somebody who can translate for them the culture so that they can be successful in whatever they tried. So that's sort of what I did for many years.
So how would you define cultural translation?
It's to try to make people understand who do not live here and haven't been born here, what it's like to do business here and how they are going to be successful or not being successful. Strangely, a lot of the times is telling them what they shouldn't do as opposed to what they should do.
Okay. What's the best example you can use of somebody who maybe needed a reminder or some cultural translation, and then maybe somebody who did it well?
Yeah. I'll give you an example. I used to do a lot of work with New York law firms that already had the client, and the client wanted to come here for whatever reason and needed co-counsel, particularly lawyers from New York, litigators from New York. They are totally insensitive to relationships, right? And I remember going before one judge in a conference and telling this heavy-duty New York lawyer, just don't say anything, just to be quiet. And right in the middle of the discussion, he says, well, in New York, this is how we do it. And of course, the judge went nuts, right? So that's an example of somebody who's culturally insensitive, doesn't understand what he's doing.
What's the intervention then at that point? Right?
The
So now you're
intervention,
doing damage control, right?
yeah, you're in damage control. There's nothing you can do. I mean, the damage is already done. The judge has gotten the message, that he's smarter than the judge. And what are you doing? That's stupid. So at that point, you just got to grin and bear it. Best example, probably Bill Mills. Bill Mills is an investor. He was married to a woman from Maui, came to Hawaii for David Murdoch to run Castle and Cooke. After he left Castle and Cooke, he had his own portfolio. And he went to Maui and he bought 1,000 acres in central Maui that A&B had owned. And I had been on the A&B board, so I knew about it. They had tried for decades to get that area rezoned into residential. Billy Mills was able to do it in 17 months, which is really phenomenal. And part of that had to do with the fact that he was a really sensitive person by nature. He was instinctive almost, I think. His ability to read people was just incredible. He came from a small town in West Virginia, and that probably helped, and had lived with a Filipina for many years, and his wife. So I think all of those things help. But he's probably the most successful I can remember of outside capitalists coming to Hawaii. And he still lives here. And he's never left since then, of someone that can be that successful that quickly.
So if you tried to put it into like some tactical or strategic steps for people who say, I want to be able to do this, what would you say?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you probably ought to tell them things not to do. It's a more negative kind of thing. Tell them your opinion about politics is not going to be important to very many people, and the other half are going to dislike you because of your position. So cool it.
That's politics in general or just local one?
Particularly local politics, but any politics. If you're trying to enter any kind of a culture, the last thing you want to do is express how you feel. Nobody cares how you feel. And in Hawaii, and particularly in Hawaii, we're used to transients. We're used to people that come in and go out, come in and go out. And as a result of that, I think we tend to be initially very welcoming, but at a certain level, it's not welcoming at all. In fact, it's resistant. And so they just need to understand that.
So did you ever have kind of like a FAQ or worksheet that you say, here?
Doing business
off.
in Hawaii, I did. Yeah, actually I did. It's now very dated. But once in a while, I'll see something and I'll dig it up. It has all the rules about not talking about politics and about others need to speak for you as opposed to you speaking for yourself. That what you do is a hell of a lot more important than what you say. I think the other thing about Hawaii that makes it unique is that perceptions outlast reality by a long shot. If you come into a situation where people perceive you as a negative person, you can change and become a very positive person, but that perception will outlast that reality. And that's something that you tell people when you make a mistake, when you do something that you shouldn't have done, it's going to haunt you. So be careful.
You have a good example of that?
Well, the lawyer from New York was an example because we got our asses kicked after that by the judge. The judge was going to show him, right? I mean, they're judges like everybody else, they're human beings. And so somebody tells them, hey, you're not too smart, well, he's going to prove to you. And the way he does that is by making you sweat, right? So, yeah, that's probably the best example I know of that. But it happens in a lot of other situations too. And usually capitalists are pretty simple people. If they understand that they need something, they buy it. And cultural translation to some degree is a commodity. And so they find somebody, they ask around who they should use as an advisor. And oftentimes I would get calls.
What's the best story or example of someone who turned it around? They came in and it was like, oh, this guy's lame, and then maybe turned it around and actually did really well.
There aren't a lot of them, because in Hawaii, most of the time these are people who are not from here. They're not going to stay here.
Oh.
So if they're not successful, they're out of here. I mean, they find other places to go where transactions are more important than relationships or whatever it is. There are cases where people have recovered from doing stupid things, but it takes them a long time, and usually it's in a field other than what they originally came for.
You have any specific examples that you could mention, or?
Not many. I can't think of any, to tell you the truth. It tends to be fatal.
Yeah.
Right? In a small town, you come in from you're on the outside, you screw up, you make a big bad mistake, and this is not your home. Correction takes a lot longer than making the mistake.
Mm-hmm. How many years was your career?
Golly, too long. The first 30 years were really practicing law. After that, my life changed. And so for the next 20 years, probably, it was much more doing work with boards, sitting on boards. I think I sat on 6 public company boards at one time or other. And then on top of that, I sat on a lot of private company boards as well as nonprofits.
Wait, so how do you manage that time?
You have a really wonderful assistant. I had an assistant, Gail Kawahara, for 52 years. And when she finally decided rightfully that she was going to spend the rest of her days babysitting grandchildren, it was probably one of the worst days of my life, because she effectively, every morning I got up, I got a 3x5 card, tell me where to go and what to say. I mean, she was remarkable. And she's still around. We see each other quite often, as a matter of fact.
So you have to stop doing a lot of things because now it's all on your own, or what?
Well, that's an interesting question. Since my sermon, my life has changed, and my relationship with my wife has dramatically changed. The reason is because she decided, with a little help from me, that she could do a lot of that paperwork. And my schedule, of course, got a little bit easier. But all the stuff that I never paid attention to, paying bills and all that, she took over. What it meant for me was I needed to do something to contribute to the relationship. So now I do the laundry, I do the dishes, I do the vacuuming, I do the ironing, and that's sort of my job. And I do the gardening in the front of our house. She does the vegetable gardening in the back. So our roles have turned upside down, which I find really kind of satisfying, actually. I think I got the better end of the deal than she did. Most of my life has been driven by things that have beginnings but no ends. They just kind of go on and on. And some of them don't even have a beginning. They just translate into something else. Doing tasks when you're retired and older, probably, that have a beginning and an end is really rewarding. You sweep the driveway. You start, you finish, you look at, you see the driveway's clean, and that's it. And that's very satisfying, I think.
The main perspectives that have changed now that you're in semi-retirement versus before?
Over time, several people have come to me and asked me about what's retirement like and what they ought to be doing in retirement. One of the things I tell them is when you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? They look at me like, what are you talking about? What do I see? I say, what do you see? Who do you see in the mirror? Because if you see a lawyer or if you see an executive, retirement is going to be very difficult. You got to see something else. You got to see something that goes beyond yourself in retirement. And you got to change your perception of who you are fundamentally to be able to retire. Otherwise, you get really frustrated. When I get up in the morning, I look in the mirror and I see a houseboy, and I see a grandfather, and I see a husband, and I see a gardener. And so that means that I can be happy, if I do that. I see other things too. I still do nonprofit work and board work, but very different level of stress than public company boards.
Did you find it hard to not be as important to others? You know what I mean? Now that you come off of these big positions, not as many people coming to ask you for things and so on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Was that hard for you?
Not at all. It was fine. It's harder for me to deal with recognition than it is with memory of what things were. In fact, it frustrates my wife because I tend to avoid things like this, actually. But I tend to avoid recognition. And it's not because I don't have an ego. It's just that I don't feel comfortable doing it. Maybe it's just growing up in Hawaii, right? You don't seek that. She, on the other hand, is really active, doing a lot of community volunteers, and a lot of those contacts often come from me. And so she says, you ought to stay active. You ought to stay engaged. And I try to do that, but engagement to me is different than recognition. And I just don't feel terribly comfortable with recognition.
So what did you learn about yourself now that you're semi-retired that you didn't realize before?
Probably that some things that I thought were important aren't that important. Frankly, my career, my legal career, wasn't that important. At the time, I thought it was, of course, I was running in front of a train, so that always helps, right? But there are a lot of things that aren't that important. I mean,
why is it not that important?
Well, because it takes up too much time and it interferes with other things that should have been priorities. Nobody in their deathbed ever says, "Gee, I wish I had spent more time at the office," right? I mean, quite the opposite.
So, what would you have spent your time on then?
I think I would have spent more time with my kids. I was busy running around. Fortunately, my wife is a great mother, so she handled that really well. But there's a surprise in that. I am amazed at how good my children are as parents. I mean, I am amazed. All of them. I have one. Our daughter lives in New York, doesn't have any children, but she's a great auntie. But the other three are wonderful parents, much better than I perceived myself to be. And that's gratifying, I think. But I wish I had spent more time with them. I spent a lot of Sundays with them. And that's what they remember. But when you spend time with 4 children and when you spend time with 4 kids, you tend to treat them as a group. You guys do this, or you guys do that, or why don't we all do this? And you don't get to know them as well individually. And I think I'm sorry about that. So I'm getting to know them now when they're in their 40s and 50s, which is also gratifying. But I wish I had done that when they were younger.
So spend more time with them individually when they were younger.
Yeah.
Like how much time would you have changed if you could do it now?
In the early days when we had young children, it would be unusual for me to be home before 10 o'clock at night, right? So they're sleeping already. So the next morning I'm up and I'm out there in the office and they're getting ready for school. So you see them in the morning a little bit and that's it. And that's not enough. That really isn't enough. And especially if you have 4 kids so that you're treating them all as a group again, right? I wish I had done less of what I was doing in the professional side and more as a father.
Like what kind of allocation though would it be though? You would come home by 5?
Oh, I think so. I think coming home for dinner or some time when there's a regular ritualistic time frame, maybe dinner, because in the morning it's too hectic and whatnot, right? And our children, I don't know what their allocation is. I used to try to take them individually on trips, okay? But I'd be on a business trip, right? So, we were staying in a fancy hotel and, during the day they're watching television while I'm at an office meeting and I come back and then we go out to fancy, dinner or a show in New York. It's kind of an artificial environment, I think. So allocation of time, hard to say, but I would have spent a lot less time trying to build up a law firm. Although I had fun doing that too. I mean, obviously the reason I did it wasn't because I had to. I wanted to do it. So it was a choice.
Plus at that time you figure you're a lawyer and then the next stage is build up a law firm and so on, right? It's kind of a natural progression.
It's a natural progression. And your dad called me one time. He said, "Hey, you're retiring?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How are you doing that?" And I told him the same thing. I said, when you look in the mirror in the morning, what do you see? I always had the feeling that he could retire, but he was going to have a little bit more difficult.
Did he tell you what he saw?
I don't remember what he said, but it wasn't a retired person or a gardener or a
Was it a joke?
housekeeper.
Like a handsome guy or something like that? 'Cause
Yeah, I
flipped
think
off.
it probably was. It
Yeah.
was not a serious answer, but it was a serious question, because I think that's true in my experience, that people who continue to see themselves in a position that they're no longer going to be in are going to be unhappy.
I think the retirement in that route for my father was very difficult.
Yeah, that's what it's.
When you derive your kind of like identity from that type of work and so on, or whether it's Wildlife Country Club or whatever it is, it becomes very hard to decouple that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think it was very hard. I almost feel like it's better not to retire, just cut the workload down
Yeah.
a bit.
Well, I had the feeling that because I didn't know your dad that well. I mean, we were contemporaries, but for him to call me and ask me, because we were both coming out of a firm too, right? I think that was the other similarity. And I think I told him that there are no assets to a law firm. You cannot leave it to your kids, right? It's a cash flow. It's really a cash flow function. So you don't own anything in a law firm, which is different than many senior partners believe to be the case. Right? They believe that they own the clients. You don't own the clients. The clients decide whether they're going to stay or go. Well, who are they going to go with? I mean, you don't own them.
Yeah.
So it's different than if you start a business where you have equity and that has value.
The interesting thing about that is, you probably know because you're pretty intuitive, but the message that my dad sent you just by calling you and asking that is great admiration. My dad's not the type to go and ask somebody something for advice if he's not super serious about it.
Yeah.
And he's not necessarily he's the type that holds his emotions and so on kind of to himself. That is a huge compliment and like admiration. So
well, I will accept it, because I had
high
great respect for your
appreciation.
dad.
Yeah.
It probably meant also how serious he was at the time about trying to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. I think it seems to me.
If I read into that, what it sounds to me like is, Jeff, this freaks me out. I don't know how to navigate this without freaking out.
Yeah.
What did you do? How does this work? Because I'm not sure about this. That's kind of how it reads to me.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate.
Yeah. And I don't want to say anything.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah, he
I don't want to
couldn't
be
talk to his
perceived
colleagues,
like that.
right? So, I mean...
And not going to tell us.
Yeah.
Anything, he's going to make a joke or something. Or call me fat. You know what I mean? Like, or whatever, yeah.
We never talked about it again after that call. And because I think I don't know, maybe he came to some realizations about himself. Maybe he just decided, to hell with it. I'm just going to do what I continue to do and, deal with it. Because dealing with a firm can be difficult. I mean...
I think the hard thing on that is that, this is what I saw with my dad's funeral in particular, was there was an inordinate amount of prior work people that he had worked with that came out of the woodworks, people that were really young or really old, whatever, saying about how he impacted their life. For my dad, who's somebody who really kind of valued relationships, and that was probably his strongest need, I don't think he could let it go. Because even though he's out of the firm, if somebody that was there that he worked with had even their kid is sick or something, he's got to go in there and help them. Like, that's just his deal. Like, it would be very, very tough. But I was really endeared because some of them would come and they would give the gift from the firm and they give the gift from themselves. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting. He was an interesting guy. But he was
a good word.
Kind of typical, I think, in some respects, from an attitudinal perspective, typical of our generation. And I think he was brought up pretty much as a traditionalist in terms of what he was supposed to do and what his responsibility.
Yeah, gay old Chinese lady telling you what to do. What you talking about?
Right.
You kind of too bad.
Yeah.
So maybe, is there something that you remember or a story with my father that would give me some kind of interesting insight or appreciation?
I see him at Wildlife. He had a lot of close relationships there. People really liked him. I think he got involved even in governance issues at the Wildlife. And I would see him and we would say hello and whatnot, but that was about it.
I mean, he had 4 loves: his family, his law firm, Wildlife Country Club, and Punahou School.
Really?
After that, everything else is far and far, far beyond that. But that was his loves. Yeah.
Well, Punahou is a K through life.
Yeah. You're not on the board anymore at Punahou.
No, I'm off the board.
Right?
I aged off the board. Age 75 is you age off.
Would you have stayed on if you didn't age off?
Reluctantly.
Why?
Punahou's board is really an engaged board. The large majority of them went to Punahou. If they didn't go to Punahou, their children went there. So it's a consuming board. It's also structured so that the committee work is where the strength is. The chair passes on every 2 years. So in 2 years, what can you do? The chairs stay on for a long time. It's the kind of board that's structured with strong committees.
You cannot hide, Kang, right? You got to work.
And the amount of work that is done at Punahou is extraordinary for a board. I spent as much time on the board of Punahou than I did at the board of Alexander and Baldwin or Matson or Hawaiian Electric. Really a lot of time. Maybe not Hawaiian Electric because I was chair. What I tried to add to the board was a non-Punahou perspective because I felt that they needed that. Not because they were wrong. They just had a different view. The lens that they looked through was a Punahou tinted lens, which is wonderful, but it's also sometimes not realistic. Sometimes.
Like, what does that mean? Punahou tinted lens?
Well, as I said, Punahou has sort of been described as K through life, and I think there's some truth to that. And so, example would be, there used to be debates from time to time on why we did the carnival. What? And the focus always, for some, tended to be, especially for the classes, how much money they make, what the gross proceeds are. But they, used to get a lot of parents who used to say, hey, you know what? Why don't you just ask me for money? I give you the money instead of having me work 20 hours a week for 6 weeks, making chutney or whatever it is. The perspective I thought that was important for Punahou is it's the one time that I know of that Punahou opens itself up to the rest of the community. And that's really important. And it's not enough. And I think Punahou has done much more now with public schools and whatnot, but it's still a closed loop. And closed loops can oftentimes drive decisions that are not good. So my job was to say, hey, that's not what people think. I once asked my son, my eldest son, Michael. He used to catch the bus all the time. So I said, hey, Mike, you ever wear a Punahou t-shirt on a bus? He looked at me and said, are you crazy? Right? That told me something. This was 30 years ago, 25 years ago. But it's sort of indicative of the fact that people understand that there is a difference and there are different perceptions that people have. And that's it's cultural, right? It's a cultural translation of trying to figure out how people will react to a certain kind of thing.
So Mike's my classmate, right?
Yeah.
And when we were in school, my other friend would say, I'm not wearing a shirt that says punch me. Right? You go out of this range, it means you go into the wrong area. This means punch me.
Yeah.
So, right?
That's a good one.
Yeah. So, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I have a grandson, 15, Katie's eldest, Sam, who wears a Punahou water polo shirt everywhere he goes. So I asked him the other day, I said, you like those shirts? He said, oh, I love these shirts. I said, is it because they're comfortable? Yeah. Is it because of what it says? Yeah. For all the same reasons. So maybe he doesn't catch the bus. So I don't know. Or he doesn't go into neighborhoods either.
Just takes a few punches. You wear a different shirt.
That's funny. I got to remember that one.
So what would you say is kind of the main theme of like where your true value lies on these boards? So if you look at like outside wise and go, why did people invite Jeff Watanabe and, keep you on those boards?
Yeah.
What's the number one reason?
I don't know if it's the number one reason, but I'll tell you a story. I got out of law school in 1968. Okay. Probably the same time your dad got out of law school.
Didn't you go to George Washington?
George Washington.
Yeah. You guys went to the same school. Yeah.
Came back to Hawaii. I had worked out of the senator's office, Senator Inouye's office. Came back to Hawaii. He's the one who convinced me I had to come back. So I come back. I join a law firm that had originally been started by Bert Kobayashi Sr., who became Attorney General and then was a justice on the Supreme Court. George Ariyoshi, who became a senator and then became governor. Russell Kono, who became a judge. It was a period of time when the whole world politically was changing in Hawaii. I think what was happening was that up until late 1950s, economic power and political power were fused. The same people had both. What was happening in the late 50s and into the 60s was economic power and political power started to divert, and that left a huge opening in the law firm market. And that diversion continued. It continues to this day to some degree, right? The big five is no longer here. There's only one left, A and B. The political power is now totally outside of the economic power, with some exception to that. My association with the senator and Governor Ariyoshi and a bunch of other people who came from that era was valuable to companies.
So your association meaning like you were close?
Yeah. I mean, for a good period of time, Dan Inouye was extraordinarily powerful politically and had great influence in whatever he did, both in Washington as well as here. He poured in huge amounts of money into Hawaii. He was either chairman or ranking member of Defense Appropriations since 1987. He and Stevens. And they just kompang, right? They were when one was chair, the other was ranking, the other was chair, and it didn't really matter. Each of them got what they wanted. Nobody's ever said this to me, but I think the perceived relationships I had, and again, perception outstrips reality, was an important function. Now, in addition to that, particularly on public company boards, the one that takes the risk is the first board, right? I mean, you're in the first board. And if you behave on that board and you can be helpful on that board, then you become an easy pick for other boards. And I think that there's a certain kind of a snowball effect, I think. And so that happens. So you got that issue. You got the fact that I had spent a lot of time trying to understand governance issues. And so as time went on, that became important. I sat on a lot of nonprofit boards. Community involvement, again, when you're buying a package for a board member, you're looking at community involvement, you're looking at political connectivity, you're looking at behavior, you're looking at a whole bunch of things. So it's not that one is more important than the other, but those are probably the two that are not usual.
Mm-hmm. How would you describe your relationship with Senator Inouye? And how did you build that? Because you're so much younger. I mean, you're like a junior person, and then he's already, big time.
Keep in mind that when I worked for the senator in Washington, when I worked out of his office, I was on his patronage, actually, which means in Washington that you work for him, but somebody else pays you. I mean, that's what patronage is. And Washington is
like a sponsor, kind of.
Used to be full of patronage. Well, it has more to do with budgeting.
Oh.
You could be on committee staff, right? But you worked for the senator.
Who paid it then?
The committee staff.
Oh.
Yeah. It didn't come out of his budget, right? So I was on the post office staff. I was a cop for a year. You could be elevator operator. You can be a committee staffer, where you're technically being paid by some other budget, but you knew who you worked for. Right? And you spent time in the office. That's the way it worked. When I was on patronage in his office, he was a 44-year-old senator. He wasn't that old, right? Who had never lost an election. I didn't get to know him that well, except, the organizational chart for a senator oftentimes looks like a wagon wheel with him in the center and everybody else rotating around, or revolving around him. So when he was in the office, everybody was in the office. And if he was waiting for a vote at 9:00 at night, everybody was in the office. That's the way it worked. And he'd get bored. So he'd come around and talk to people. And once in a while, he would talk to me. And so I got to understand him a little bit more. In those days, he only hired patronage positions from GW.
Why?
Because he went there.
Oh.
And he was close to the president. When I graduated from law school, he said to me, you really got to go back home. I said, well, I got some offers on committee. He says, don't do that. Go home. He said, you think you got here all by yourself? You got here because a lot of other people gave up stuff for you. True. So go back, at least try to pay it back. That was his word. When I left in 1968, it was an election year. He was up for re-election. And he told me, I don't want to see you around the campaign office, because that was sort of part of the deal too, right? I mean, you're going to be on his patronage. Campaign time, you got to come out. He said, you go study for the bar. You come out next election, which would have been 1974. A lot was going on. Watergate was in full bloom. He was on the committee, special Watergate committee in the Senate. He was becoming famous with Sam Erwin and those guys, right? And as it turned out, the Special Watergate Prosecutor's Office, when they started to investigate the committee to re-elect, which was Nixon, it was like them putting a pen on a blotter. It just spread, right? Because a lot of the stuff that was being done by the committee to re-elect, other people were doing too. And one of the things that happened in that 74 period was that the rules changed about political contributions. You couldn't take cash anymore. In the old days, bundles of cash would fly around. But I mean, it could be reported too, but oftentimes wasn't. And the world changed. So what happened was some of the old timers got caught in that because their world didn't change. It's just that the law changed, right? And his committee got into trouble. It got into trouble because they had taken money from, actually turned out to be the owner of the Yankees. And rather than reporting it, they turned it back because he had gotten into trouble with campaign spending. And that was illegal. And the prosecutors started investigating a guy by the name of Henry Juni, who was his chief of staff. And I was at the campaign committee office once when Henry was kind of bragging about the fact that he's going to appear before the Special Watergate Prosecutor's Office because they're investigating a guy by the name of Claude Wild, who was with an oil company, and he knew Claude really well. And when I looked at the paper, I said, Henry, they're not investigating Claude Wild, they're investigating you. Because he said, how do you know that? I said, well, you take a look at the reference numbers, right, on the past stuff. The reference number had changed. And that ended up with me spending the next 18, 19 months commuting to Washington, working with the Special Watergate Prosecutor's Office. It turned out that the truth was a lot less damaging than what their perception was. And it took a while to get them to come around, the Watergate Prosecutor's Office, to get them to come around to what the truth was. So, and I got to know the senator really well because he was on the Special Watergate Committee, Select Committee, investigating some of the same people that the campaign committee had a relationship with. So it was really a sensitive time.
So weird conflicts almost, yeah?
Yeah. And so I was traveling secretly to Washington, and I would go to a law firm that was a friend of the senators and use their offices. I'd stay in the hotel, and we'd meet all over. And what I'm telling you is it's been in the press. So, and we ended up taking a plea, but a minor misdemeanor plea on a technical violation. But it took us over a year to get through that whole process. In the meantime, I got to see the senator in situations that I would never have been able to do. And it built up a sense of trust and confidence. And this is an odd thing to say, but when I saw the senator under stress, he was incredibly calm. And I came to the conclusion that people who have seen the faces of men that you kill, which he did, see the world differently. They just see the world differently. After going through that, nothing shakes them very much. And he was like that. It's very, you put people under a lot of pressure and you see a whole bunch of different kind of reactions, from panic to, he was, serene wasn't the right word, but he got cold, kind of a cold, kind of calculating thing, and he just dealt with it. Anyway, as an aside. So we got to be pretty close. And then over the next several campaigns, it became clear, because he would ask me to do stuff, that other people became very aware of the fact that we had a relationship. In the meantime, George was governor. So the political connections were pretty obvious. And I think that may not have been the primary reason why I started sitting on a lot of boards or having a lot of clients, but that was probably not unimportant.
The interesting thing when I listen to that, and it does give me a lot of context in how you get trust. I mean, you're right there in the line of fire with them. You know what I mean? That builds trust. It's almost like football two-a-days, right? You suffer together and you become more friends, or Hell Week for fraternities or boot camp. You know what I mean? Through that kind of trials and tribulations, you get closer.
Yeah.
The interesting thing to me is it's almost like the effect are the relationships, but then the cause is your kind of dedication and your skill and your sensitivity to things that makes it happen. You know what I mean? That's
Yeah.
kind of the causal piece. So to me, when I look at that, okay, it makes sense, bringing somebody who's connected and so on. But what you're really bringing is what builds that connection
Correct.
underneath.
Yeah.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that story. That was really
No, that's true.
insightful to
I think
me.
the biggest example I know of seeing that were guys who were part of the 442nd. At the end of the day, what they were thinking about when they were going through all that shit was not the war. It was their buddies. Their buddies became the driving force, I think, for what they did. And that never ended. They never ended. From the time, I mean, most of them are dead now, but it developed a kind of loyalty that you only see, I think, when you put people in that kind of situation.
So the 442nd, right? The most decorated group, I think, of soldiers, was it ever even?
In military history.
Military history, right? So what would be kind of your most impactful memory or story from them, or something that one of them maybe shared with you?
A lot of my knowledge of the 442nd really came out of the senator. And part of the reason is because people who are part of the 442nd, they don't talk. It's hard for them to talk about it. It brings back memories, I think, that are difficult. I spent enough time with the senator that I felt comfortable sometimes asking him about things. And sometimes he would come out, just say, I mean, I remember once he was at the office and he said, well, I think we ought to celebrate today. And I said, well, it's not your birthday. He said, no, it's the day I lost my arm. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it changed my life. Before that, I wanted to be a surgeon or whatever. He said surgeon, and I couldn't do that. So I ended up going to law school and ended up becoming a United States senator, and then I changed my whole life. But it was an interesting way for him to look at that. And then he would talk about, how he lost his arm. And it's kind of frightening, I mean, you can read excerpts about how he did it, but why do you do that? You do that for reasons other than the philosophical issues of saving the world from Nazism. You do it because your father told you don't come home and disgrace us. You do that because your buddies are under fire and you're going to stop it. I mean, it's a whole bizarre, same thing like boot camp or football in a lesser way, probably. Those relationships last a long time.
So what would be something that most people, I guess, would not know about the senator that would be surprising or endearing, or, like, wow, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
He loved fish.
Like eating it or?
Goldfish.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know where it started. Maybe as a kid he he raised pigeons or something in Wa'iliili, but he loved goldfish. And I remember during 9/11, they closed down all of the Senate office buildings. Nobody could go in. And I found out later that he got in by convincing one of the guards that he needed to go feed his fish. But he had a thing about goldfish. It was a big deal. And the staff all knew it too, so they all kind of made sure that if there was something going on in the fish tank that the senator would want to know, he told them. That was one thing. The other thing I found strange about him is that he had a ceremonial office and a working office. They were very different. The ceremonial office was what you would expect from a ceremony. You got a lot of everything from Indian relics to World War II stuff to the Italians who... Anyway, and then he had a small office that was a working office. There was a place for somebody to sit. There's really small offices. And he never spent time in the ceremonial office unless people came to visit or something. He would sit there. It told me something about him, about understanding the theatrics of his position, I think. I was in his ceremonial office one day and I opened a coat closet. And on the bottom of the coat closet was a case of very expensive French champagne. So the senator rarely drank. So I said, Senator, what's the wine for? He said, well, my brother, Ted Stevens, was this Republican senator from Alaska. He's the one that Inouye and he were like brothers. Every time he does something for me, I know he loves wine, so I send him a bottle. And that reminded me of the fact that the senator was actually a licensed bartender. I mean, he was a member of the bartending union. And when he was majority leader in the state house, he had a bar in there, he said, and that he knew what everybody drank. So when people would come in, he would mix them their drink. And he said it was wonderful for relationships. And I think he's right. I mean, I think his attention to that kind of stuff was really important. And nobody knew about it. I didn't know about it either. But he was a bartender. And he'd come to my house. He'd come to our house. We'd have a dinner or something. The only thing he drank was gin.
Like not even water?
No, he would mix it. Gin and tonic or something. But it was gin. If you asked him to mix a drink, he was a pro. And he knew how to do it. So he was sensitive to those kinds of proclivities, I guess, on the part of people he wanted to build a relationship with.
Do you also kind of feel like that's the message that's sent when the U.S. Senator knows your drink and makes it with one arm?
Yeah.
Is like really kind of endearing. Like, oh, because you're kind of watching like, oh, bro, this guy got one arm, you know, like you can spill or what. I would be watching like, oh, wow, that's something. Because you got plenty of people around that could do it for you.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a big thing for him. Something else, he was allergic to flowers. Now, being a politician in Hawaii, being allergic to flowers is a challenge. But if you'll notice, he'll take pictures with the lei on. But if you'll notice, he always had some non-floral lei on because he had allergies.
So what would he do then? If someone gives him a lei, then he'd take the picture and
he would have somebody else take it off, you know, and then he would wear a kukui nut or something like that, or something that didn't have flowers in it.
So would you say he's one of the most influential people in your life?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that's true. We used to sit around thinking what he couldn't do with having one arm. You
mean with the other staff?
With other staff. And we figured out you could do, he always wore a tie, right? So you could do a tie by tying it first and putting it over your overhead shoulder and stuff. The one thing we couldn't figure out was how does he put on cufflinks, because he used to wear cufflinks. Mm-hmm. So I think somebody who had the balls asked him, Senator, how you put on your cufflinks? And he said, he used to have his shirts made. So he said, I put on the cufflink with the shirts off, and I put my hand through like that. Mm-hmm. And I make the opening a little bit wider than most. So if you look at pictures of him when he's wearing cufflinks, the opening is a little bit broader than most people. But that's the kind of silliness you go through when you have nothing to do and trying to figure out what you can share. Right?
Yeah. You known somebody for, almost your whole working career, right?
Yes.
Would you say he's been your most important mentor?
No.
Okay. Who was your most important mentor then?
Wow. Plenty. I learned a lot from Herb Cornell.
Okay. Here, wait, before we go to Herb Cornell, the thing I'm curious on, and you can answer or not, is like at the end of his life. Because that's the kind of thing, I'm at a stage now where people important to me, many relations and so on, are either sick and dying. Yeah. And to me, it's very hard. It's just hard to navigate, man. Like the grievance. So I'm wondering for you if you have any, what was your perspective on that at the end? Because he was sick and then he died, right? So, how was that for you? How do you handle that? What do you remember from it?
I don't see death as the end. Not because I have some notion about what happens to people after they die. I think what happens to people after they die is the same thing that happened to people before they were born. And nobody ever worries about what they were before they were born, right?
Which is what?
Nothing.
Oh.
So, why should you worry about what's going to happen after you die? Other than the fact that obviously the answer is that you have now experienced things and so you're going to lose those things, right?
Well, it's more like I lost somebody that is so important to me. You know what I mean? Yeah. You don't feel it that way?
Well, I got a call the other day. I was actually in the garden, and this woman called me. And she says, Jeff? I said, yes. Joan Brown here. It's Kenny's wife. I got up this morning and said, I'm going to call Jeff. And so we had this long discussion about her. She's 99 years old. Her husband was a close friend, and I learned a lot from him in one specific, more targeted area. But things like that are great. I mean, that's what energizes me. But I don't. Herb Cornell, how did he die? He died from pancreatic cancer. But before he died, we were trying to figure out a way of how you celebrate his life, and not wait until he dies. And I think Carol Fox came up with the idea that if we honored him along with other people, he would have to come. So we had a dinner at our house.
Because you figured he wasn't coming.
He had decided he wasn't going to get any treatment at all, right? Other than pain. But he knew already that the end was near. But he didn't die for several months. But anyway, we had a dinner at our house, and we were honoring Sam Cooke, Keiji Kawakami, and Herb Cornell. And Eddie Kamai came to our house and said he wanted to entertain the group, which was a real treat. I think he brought the rest of the Sons of Hawaii too. But for some reason, his amplification system didn't work. I don't know why. And he sang it a cappella. And after he finished, there was absolute silence. And then from the corner of the room, we heard somebody clapping and standing, and it was Herb. So by that time, Herb knew that the party was really, the gathering was really for him. So that was, that was a joyous time. It wasn't a sad time at all. And that same thing's true, I think, most of my mentors who have lost. There was no sense of loss. You miss them, I miss Kenny Brown, but I still have some. Walter, I stay in touch with him. There was a nice article in the paper about him the other day. Dwayne Steele, E Ku'u Morning Dew, was Herb's favorite song. Senator. I saw George the other night. He's 97 years old. Ariyoshi. Still hanging in. But, I see the end of life as somewhat celebratory. You finished it. I hope people don't have a whole lot of regrets. That's what you worry about, right? If anything. That they're happy with whatever they were able to accomplish, and it's okay. There are going to be things about life that you wish had been different, but they tend to be hopefully smaller in the scheme of things than what, the rest of what was positive, I think.
So for you then, do you have regrets?
No, regret is too strong a term. I wish I had spent more time with my children. That's one thing. There are a couple of relationships that I cut off that in retrospect I wish I hadn't. But that's about it.
Are those relationships able to be kind of repaired, or are they dead already? Or
yeah,
what?
Probably not. They've been left alone too long. There aren't very many of those, but somebody pissed me off, and I cut them off.
So
I regret the fact that I don't think they understood why. Tell you the truth, in fact, I didn't tell them.
Less of the losing of the relationship, more that they didn't understand why.
Well, that I didn't tell them why. I think if I had told them why, I had a really good friend who was a big trial lawyer out of New York, brought his family to Hawaii, and we met them out at the North Shore. They'd rented a house, and he apparently had a really bad experience with somebody, Hawaiians or something. And he went off about, unless Hawaii has been able to figure out, how to avoid its xenophobic da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And he just pissed me off. It wasn't that he was wrong necessarily, but he was mouthing off about things he didn't really understand. Now, if that had been a client, I would have probably treated him differently. I would have said, look, you want to succeed, this is the way it's going to work. I just cut him off. And we were really good friends. We were good friends. We stayed at his house in New York and whatnot. And he's still around. I still send him, New Year's card or a Christmas card or something. But I regret doing that because we were friends. And I never told him why. I felt like he was insulting me and insulting Hawaii and insulting our culture and everything else. And he could be a jerk. He was a transactional lawyer, a securities lawyer. So that's one. Not very many others. But those are the kinds of things that I wish I hadn't done.
So if that person's still alive,
yeah,
you could still actually
I
potentially repair that.
Actually, I tried. It didn't work. I wasn't getting a response, and I think he's probably over it.
Yeah.
And I don't blame him. I would have been over it too. But they're not regrets. They're just, gee, I wish I hadn't done that kind of thing, Other than that, I don't have very many regrets. Went through 2 firm splits. Those are painful, but
Splits because people like want to just do their own thing, or is like kind of contentious kind of splits?
well, interesting. There different people would have different takes on it. I'll give you mine. Our objective early on was to build a law firm that could compete with the big haole firms. And what we decided to do was to use this opening that had occurred with the split between economic and political power and try to fill that and therefore get a little bit of both. It turns out that putting together a local law firm, which nobody had ever done, Wally Fujiyama had come close to it, but he and Walter Chucks ended up splitting. So our objective was sort of to build a local law firm, give local kids a chance to. And the other big firms were doing that too, by the way. They realized the world was changing. But what I failed to realize is that many of the haole firms were able to stay together because they were transactional. They may not have liked the partner, but they were in business together. So they don't have to talk to each other. They just do their work. Local people are different. Local people take things personally. And I think the first split we had really came as that a result from that resentment and whatnot is really hard to overcome.
Were they misunderstandings now when you look at it? Or
No,
was it no?
The idea was you build a boutique firm. And a boutique firm means that you build up specialized practices within the firm so you can be more targeted. You don't have to be an all-purpose firm. And use that to drive your market position. And what we also realized was that the economy here was cyclical. So when the economy was up, you had heavy real estate practice, you had transactional stuff, you had corporate, da-da-da-da. When the market turned and went the other way and it was down, then the ones that did well were litigation, labor, all those kinds of skill sets that are needed to deal with a down market. In the early days, it would shift every 18 to 24 months. It was quick. The cycles were quick. In the early 90s, that changed, partly because of the Japanese investment in Hawaii. That cycle lasted 11 years. Upcycle. It was huge. When you have a balanced portfolio, sometimes one does better, sometimes the next one does better. Okay? So it's that balance. When you go through a cycle that lasts for 11 years, it goes like this. It doesn't change. Pretty soon, these guys think that they're the reason why the firm exists. These guys resent that. And that's what happened. We had a long upcycle. It was actually during a time when we had record revenues. And it turned out that was the worst thing to happen because I had designed the firm as a balanced, specialized boutique firm. And I didn't realize that you could have a market cycle that went that long. So that's sort of my take on it. I mean, I'm sure if you asked some of the other people, and so, it worked out okay. Bert and I were the senior guys, and we had a lot of respect for each other. So I called Bert. I said, hey, Bert, the danger of this split is that it lingers. If we're going to do it, we do it quick. And it shouldn't be a battle between me and you. It should be a battle between who you select and who I select. So I'll meet you on Saturday. You bring the coffee, I bring the donuts. And we sat down, and in 20 minutes, we decided, okay, we're going to split. We're going to give everybody a choice about who to go with. You're going to choose. I chose John Komeiji as our representative to negotiate the details, and he chose Lex Smith or something like that. And then after that, Bert and I never talked about it, other than in friendship.
So you can remain friends then?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That way we didn't get involved in a pissing contest. But that was my take on it. It was a disappointment because the firm split in half. Mm. And by that time, the firm was up to 40 attorneys or something. It was quite a few. So we were on our way, but success killed us. And that's still not a regret either. I mean, it's just shit happens. It just happened that way.
So what would you say from maybe the earliest parts of your childhood that would give us context to who you are today?
I was an only child. My parents both came from Maui. My mother came from a family who's out of the plantations. out of Punahou plantation. My father came from a family that worked for a Haole family up in Kula. His father was a gardener. His mother was a cook and house cleaner. My mother's side, there were 6 kids, and my grandfather was a carpenter. My grandmother washed clothes for the Filipino men who were cane workers. Being an only child, I think, had something to do with it. But also my father and mother were both people who were involved with business. My father was a manufacturer's rep. He worked for A&B before that in the commercial building material projects. And my mother worked for a painting company. As a result, a lot of their contacts were Haoles. My grandmother, because she was a cook for a Haole family, they ate what the family ate, right? And they were Southerners. So my father grew up eating artichokes and parsnips and shit that, nobody else ate. So his perspective also was different. And my mother was the same way. And I think as a result of that, I spent a lot of time with non-local people because many of them would come visit and whatnot. My grandmother that lived in Kula worked for the Foster family. Old man Foster took a liking to me, so he used to take me around. He was a
Campbell?
No.
Estate Foster?
Different Foster. He was the mill superintendent for Paia Mill. Those guys were like gods in Kula or on Maui in those days. I think I had more contact as an only child with non-local people, and I think that probably made a difference. Then Hawaii used to have 2 systems of public schools, English Standard, non-English Standard. On Maui, English Standard system was Kaunoa School, and it went from kindergarten to the 9th grade. I often wondered why it only went to the 9th grade. That's because Punahou started boarding in the 9th grade. So all the Haole families of upcountry went to Kaunoa School, and then the rest of the kids from Kaunoa then went to Baldwin High School or Maui High School, and then they went to Punahou.
Or HPA? Or
it was mostly Punahou in those days. All the best teachers were at Kaunoa School. To get in, you had to be able to speak proper English. So you eliminated all the plantation kids, right?
Is that what it was for? To eliminate plantation kids? Okay.
Well, it was for the preservation of spoken English, proper English. That's why they said English Standard.
But was it more of a way to kind of exclude certain people?
I think that was the effect. I assume that the original objectives of the English Standard system was genuine. And that is, they heard all these immigrants running around talking, pidgin and whatnot. And they wanted to be able to hold the core of English and keep it alive. And they did that through the English Standard System. And then when I came to Honolulu when I was about 10, once you were in an English Standard System, it wasn't geographically based. So you stayed in that same system. So then Oahu had Lincoln, Stevenson, and Roosevelt were the English Standard System.
Oh, so you went to Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. Oh. So what do people not understand about Roosevelt back then that, when we're just in today's day and age?
I think part of it was that there was a more vibrant racial mix at Roosevelt. There were a lot of Haoles were there. Some people thought that they were Haoles who couldn't get into Punahou, so they went to Roosevelt. I don't know that to be the case, but they couldn't afford it, what the situation was. But there were a lot of Haole kids at Roosevelt. Because of the English Standard System, we had really good teachers because you eliminate a whole bunch of behavioral issues in the English Standard System. You don't get the kids that are real troublesome. And it makes teaching easier, and so it attracts the better teachers. So we had really good teachers. And I think all of those experiences, and I spent a lot of time on the plantation, which I think helped me understand what was happening and how things were, how people behaved, and more importantly, what their reactions were. So it was a mix of circumstances, I think, that gave me perceptions that other people may not have had the opportunity to get.
So what would be those perceptions or the most important ones?
One thing in my world, you needed to be bilingual, right? That's not true today.
You mean pidgin and
you need
proper
to be,
English?
You needed to be proficient at both because it depended on who you were talking to that you determined which one you were going to use. So it's like a foreign language. That was
That's mannerisms and everything then.
Yeah, everything.
Yeah.
That was really extraordinarily helpful, I think, because you could connect with a whole bunch of different people and have them feel comfortable. I could talk to a Haole and feel like, and I could talk to a real local person who spoke only pidgin. And I think that kind of thing helps. So that certainly was one of them. Understanding the relationship between how Haoles thought from the mainland and how really local people thought, what life was on the plantation and what people had to go through to get to where they wanted to get. All of that was importance of education and a lot of things I think that I had the advantage of that other people may not have.
So that whole cultural translation piece is something that was deeply rooted in your childhood.
I didn't know that at the time, but I think that's true. I think that
I mean, you're straddling
you,
two
you
worlds.
you become a little bit of a chameleon, right?
Yeah, you're straddling two worlds, right? Your father's world,
Yeah.
plus in the school system.
Right.
I mean, you're seeing everything from plantation
Yeah.
at the most root layer of washing clothes for the worker, up to the big boss and people coming in and stuff.
Yeah.
And then you can speak both languages.
At Punahou School, for instance, one of the things they had for lessons was fencing. Can you imagine? Fencing.
Yeah.
At school. I mean, that kind of thing. That was a real Haole environment. There were local kids there too, but the local kids all spoke proper English.
Yeah, like local kind of fencing is grab the stick, whack your friend. You know what I mean? That's fencing.
That's right. Anyway, so I think that all of that contributed to what I ended up doing for most of my professional life, I think.
What was your perspective on Punahou School when you were going to Roosevelt? Because there's a rivalry and so on back then. You know what I mean?
Huge.
What was your perspective?
It was not a comfortable feeling, to tell you the truth. In fact, when they started the Case Middle School campaign, Larry and Claire were chairs. And the board decided that they were going to be part of a school rally to kick off the campaign. And all of them were going to wear Punahou, football shirts or whatever it was. And I told Claire and Larry, I said, I love you both, but I ain't going to do that. They said, well, come on. It's just, I said, I don't give a shit. I said, I got friends of mine from Roosevelt that are going to turn over, the ones that are dead are going to turn over in their graves.
They're going to punch you.
Yeah, they're going to punch me. So I didn't do it. But then they said, okay, but if we raise the 24 million, then will you wear a jersey? I said, yeah, you guys never going to raise 24 million bucks. I said, okay. They raised 24 million bucks. In fact, they went over, I think. And I thought, well, they could forget. They did not forget. So I had to wear a frickin' Punahou football jersey around that Ethan Abbott fund. We got it, I think, from someplace. Anyway. Yeah, there's a level of discomfort. As time has gone on, now we have 6 grandchildren there. All 4 of our kids went there. I became a trustee there. I haven't been back to the Roosevelt. I think the last time I went to the Roosevelt campus was probably 15 years ago, maybe. And they had installed me as one of their Hall of Honor kind of recipients. And so that's the only time I ever went there.
Wait, so when you said discomfort, like what was the discomfort?
I felt disloyal. There was a little bit of a betrayal of,
Because the rivalry was so strong
It was
back
strong. It was very strong. In those days, I don't think anybody knows about it now, but they used to have a paintbrush trophy.
Yeah.
Right? Homecoming game was
then.
always...
To paint the dome of the other people's
they'd-
place, right? Yeah.
And not too long ago, when Jim Scott was president, they had a event up at Cook Library, and they brought out the trophy because the last game was won by Punahou, right? So I asked Jim, I said, I can borrow that. No. But so it still exists. Paintbrush trophy. It was strong. It was very strong rivalry.
That's an interesting kind of polarization going on in your system at that point, right? Well, almost reminds me of that movie, like Last Samurai, where the Japanese guys would have to be with the English guys, with the U.S. guys. You know what I mean? They're doing it, but it doesn't feel right.
Level of discomfort. Yeah, I think that's right. Some of it did, but I don't think it ever went away either, especially as a trustee. I mean, it's one thing you have kids there. Okay, you go on campus and whatnot. You go to the carnival. But when you're a trustee, you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, you're like a fiduciary.
So that part of it, I learned a lot. I learned about how strong people's connections are to Punahou. I mean, it's remarkable.
What did you learn about yourself?
That I didn't feel that,
That is
I had all these
interesting.
connections. I mean, my 4 kids, at the end of the day, 6 grandchildren, maybe 7 in another month or 2.
All your business contemporaries,
Yeah.
your friends.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? You can be there with all the people that you actually are comfortable with and so on, but in a setting where you actually don't totally feel like you belong.
Yeah.
And you actually are at the pinnacle of where you should feel like you belong, because you're running. You're like
Well,
leadership.
it reached the point too where
Interesting.
I convinced myself that my purpose in being on the board was not to be like them. And I think that probably helped.
Yeah.
That my purpose was to provide an outside perspective. And I think they found it helpful. So I was really happy when they put Dwayne Carisu on the board, because I think Dwayne can provide them, should be able to provide them that same kind of perspective that they may not otherwise have.
It's helpful to not have a yes man in there. You know what I mean? Because I know how it is. I went to Punahou. My kids are fourth generation at Punahou.
When I used to help structure boards, I would always look for a curmudgeon. I would always look for somebody who was respected, smart, and tended to be a naysayer.
Would that be like a Harry Weinberg kind?
Well, Harry's a little extreme. My guy was Maury Myers. Maury had a lot of experience. He's president of Aloha Airlines. He had run a huge trucking company. He ended up in waste management and then came back home. And he was a doubter because he was a fixer. He would go into companies that were a mess and he would have to fix them, right? And to do that, you need to have a very critical eye about what you're doing and who's there and what their capabilities are. And management hates people like that, right? But you need a curmudgeon on every board. It's really important because otherwise there's a tendency for everybody else to just try to be supportive. They're trying to be helpful, right? And in being helpful, sometimes you cloud over the questions that you should be asking.
You know, when you say something like that, I kind of think of the boards that I'm on and go, okay, wait, who's that? And then I think about it and go, oh, I think that might be me.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, no.
Like, why am I on this board? What is the...
It's
like,
important.
Maybe that
it's
is
important.
me. You know, I don't know.
Yeah. One of the things I found hard about chairing boards is that when you chair boards, you have to take a different perspective. You cannot be a curmudgeon. Oftentimes, you cannot express your real opinion because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a collective answer. Yeah.
Kind of hard to rally everybody if you're just a curmudgeon. I mean, you know.
Yeah. In fact, even when we ran the law firm, I noticed that, you know, if we were going to an interview or something, if you had the senior guys talk first, it happened that way. And you didn't know where the young guys were other than the fact that they weren't going to go buck the old guys. So I was reading about it. I was an anthropology buff, and I read about an African tribe called the Bantu. And the Bantu had a system where they had wise men, but they always started the decision-making by asking the decision from the least senior person. And then they worked their way up. So opposite occurred, that the more senior people could be influenced by the least senior people and not the opposite way around. And so for many years, I don't know if the law firm still does it. I still have an office there and I try to stay out of their way. But we used to use a band, you know, we had 16, 17 lawyers, and we would go, if on the partners meeting, we would go from the newest to the oldest. And more boards ought to be doing that, but they don't. As a result of that, if you have strong leadership, board chairs, it's efficient, but oftentimes it's not the best way to deal with it. Sometimes you really need to have the voice of the least senior person and work your way up the other way.
What is the most challenging kind of personal thing you've had to go through that you're willing to kind of share?
Recently, 15-year-old grandson, Sam Bennett,
Katie's,
swimmer, water polo goalie, He comes home after a water polo match, starts throwing up. They thought flu, something, put him back to bed. 2:00 in the morning, his father, Chris, hears a thump. And so he goes upstairs where the kids are and finds him passed out. Turns out he had a spontaneous brain bleed. Okay. 6 weeks in intensive care, 3 surgeries. We weren't sure he was going to make it. Neither was the hospital people. Another 2 or 3 months in hospital care. Miracle of miracles, he's fine. He's probably 98% fine. He continued to play water polo as a goalie, continued to swim. He's in junior ROTC. His grades improved. He's got a good-looking girlfriend. The world has changed. But it tells you how fast things can change, right? Unexpected arena. I mean, who would expect a 15-year-old athlete, right, to have that kind of serious problem? So he's got 5 holes in his head. He's got a shunt that goes from his brain to his stomach, and he's absolutely fine. But that was hard. And we were with him one day when he had an attack, a bad one that led to a second surgery.
Like an epileptic kind of, like a seizure?
No, it's just pain. Now, fortunately, he doesn't remember any of it. It turns out the brain is pretty smart. It turns it off. When he was in a coma for
So you saw
several
this.
weeks. Yeah.
You
We
saw
were with
him
him.
in the pain, and you saw him go into the coma.
Yeah. He had been in a coma before. This is the second time. Then they had to, pressure in his brain was building up again. So that's where they put in the shunt. So it takes the fluid out of the brain, cranial cavity. But that was really painful. It was the kind of thing that I think if you had a prolonged exposure to that, made me understand PTSD. Although I had an understanding earlier of my favorite ski partner was Sharon Twigsmith. Sharon and I are about the same age. They had a home, they still have a home up in Sun Valley, and we'd go up to Sun Valley and ski. And I was with her when she broke her leg in like 11 places, a compound fracture.
How old was she?
She was in her early 60s, I think. It was awful because it was soft snow, spring snow. I couldn't reach her. You know, I mean, we were stuck. I was stuck from my waist down, and she was in great pain. And I started yelling, and the doctor, this is before cell phone, there's cell phones. The doctor says, "Can I help?" I said, "Yeah." He was in the bottom of this slope. And I said, "Yeah, please." And so he started coming up, and pretty soon he was stuck. He couldn't get out. And then we couldn't get her out of the snow because the snowmobiles were.
Was she yelling?
Yeah, she was in tremendous pain. And they finally got her out by using jump skis, the big wide skis. And they came down from the top with a sled, put her in the sled.
Is this Sharon, this Nate Smith's mom?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was awful because the helplessness. You can understand why people in war, when one of their buddies gets shot or badly injured and you're there and there's not a goddamn thing you can do. Terrible. Anyway, so those situations were painful.
What did you learn from those?
The fragility of life, I guess, one. And two, how quickly it can happen. And three, how great the recovery can be. Because Sharon's fine now. She's walking around.
Yeah, I would never have known that.
Oh, it was awful. She had a terrible break. Orthopedic surgeon later went to UCLA on some conference and used that as a case study in how bad it was.
Have you ever had like what they call a dark night of the soul? Where it's just seems dismal. And then you come through it at the other end at some point. But
yeah,
it's just like while you're in it, it's like,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I've known people who have it. No, but I have not had suffered that. Although most parents that care are only as happy as their most miserable child.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So as your kids go through stuff, you worry about it. And it's usually 3:00 in the morning or something, that kind of thing. But no, I've never, to my knowledge anyway, I've never been depressed of it. I've never.
So have you ever felt like insecure or fearful?
Now more than ever. And it sounds strange, but in some respects, I have greater control over what I do now than I did before.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So throughout the major point of your career, you never had it where you felt like, oh crap, I got problems. And then you just overcome it, or never really had that?
Not that I can think of. I'm sure there were times when I worried about what my strategy was going to work. Most strategies are kind of loosey-goosey. You can alter it. I've never really been depressed. I mean, even important people in my life that we've lost, I've never been depressed about that. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but, different people develop different coping mechanisms. This my daughter tells me this. And she says that my coping mechanisms are better than most.
Yeah.
And that's how I get through these things. I just cope with it. It doesn't grind at me.
So who would you consider the most influential person in your life? Your whole life?
Maybe my maternal grandmother, who was probably the gentlest person, nicest person I've ever known. Actually, both sides, maternal and paternal, both grandmothers were, I thought, extraordinary. I spoke Japanese when I was young, a kid. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandmother. Hardworking, patient, caring. I think a lot of the human qualities that I think are important were embodied in my grandmother.
Can you share a story with or about your grandmother that would give us context into who she was, what she meant to you?
The plantation villages were racially segregated on purpose. In Punahou, which is where they lived, there was Mill Camp, which was Japanese. There was Spanish B and Spanish A, which were the Puerto Ricans and Portuguese. There was where all the Haules lived, the Luna, along the highway, and where the Filipinos lived. My grandparents lived on a street that separated the Filipino camp from the Japanese camp. And early on, because of what had happened with the Japanese, where they found wives, they didn't allow the Filipinos to have wives if you were contract labor. I mean, if you had a wife, she could be in the Philippines, that kind of a wife, but you couldn't bring her. So as a result of that, a lot of the laundry that was done by the Japanese women were across the street from the Filipinos. And these were field workers, so they had to wear heavy, long sleeve, heavy cotton clothing. So my grandmother would have to get up 4 o'clock in the morning and start outdoor fire. And what they would have to do is they would have to boil the clothes. It kept the sugarcane leaves from cutting into your skin. And you could wear the shirt a lot longer. So it was a really arduous process. And they would come by at like 6 o'clock in the morning to pick up, maybe 5:30, to pick up what had already been washed, to take it back. And I'd be sleeping in a bedroom that overlooked where they would meet. And these are Filipino men who spoke no Japanese and spoke no English. And my grandmother, who spoke no Tagalog and very little English. And I would listen to them converse in Pidgin. And the Pidgin was part Japanese, part Filipino, part Hawaiian, part English. And it wasn't, meaningful discussion, but it was enough to communicate with one another and to be friendly. And I don't think I ever forgot that. And I think that's an important aspect of who my grandmother was and why those kinds of traits were so valuable, I think. She was an interesting lady. George Ariyoshi once told me a story that kind of reminded me of my grandmother. And he said, when he was younger, he was stymied by the fact that whenever they had something really good to eat, his mother didn't like the food. So if they had steak or lobster or something like that, until he later realized that it wasn't that she didn't like the food. She just didn't want to take it because she wanted to make sure other people had it. It's kind of an unselfish view of the world. And George is a little bit like that too. I mean, and his mother lived till it was 97, 98. And I think my grandmother probably did the same thing, it's a self-sacrifice kind of thing, that thinking of other people. My wife's like that. I'm less so, but I'm trying, but my wife is very much like that. She thinks of other people. She thinks of things that I would never cross my mind to think about, but I like that. She reminds me of my grandmother, actually, I think. I never thought about that, but she does remind me of my grandmother. And my other grandmother was a wonderful woman too, but I spent less time with her, so I didn't get a chance to see a lot of her.
So what would be your favorite memory with your wife?
Probably meeting her for the first time. Her family and my family knew each other. My father and her older brother were really good friends. And when he would go to Los Angeles, she was from Pasadena, she would oftentimes see him, and he would take her out to dinner. And then when she came, she was a student at USC, and she came here for the summer. And I had been using her brother's car, and so she needed the car, so we exchanged cars. But I later found out that she had a crush on my father. Yeah. And so she said, so she tells people now, she says, I always liked old Japanese men. Now I have one of my own. But that's one of the things that I find it endearing of her. She doesn't have a mean bone in her body. She also is truthful, I think, sometimes to a fault. She wants to talk about stuff, I mean, culturally different because, in my culture, the tendency has been to, when you're under stress, to shut down. Her reaction is totally different. I mean, her theory is that you never go to bed angry. So you talk until it's resolved. Me, I like go sleep. Right? Talk about it. Push. But that's been a positive influence on me.
So when was it that you knew that she was the one?
My father said, hey, why don't you take Lynn out to dinner? I said, oh, come on, Dad. I had just come back from law school. She was a sophomore. She was like 19 years old. I was 24 or whatever. But in those days, that was a lot. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, really, why don't you show her around? Then he said, you can use my car and I'll pay. And I said, okay. So I called her up and I said, hey, you want to spend some time? I'll show you around the island. And she said, I know your father put you up to it. You don't have to do this. No. I said, no, it's my idea. And so we did. We went around and I took her to Miley, of all places, because an old friend of mine was out there, Anson Rego. And his family owned a restaurant out in Miley, more bar. So I took her out there, and I was stunned by her. She's a genuine person. She drank like half a case might be an exaggeration, but she had been in SC and she was in training for drinking. Right, there was a frat girls, sorority girls, and stuff like that. But she was just genuine, really genuine, and I think that I did not have a good opinion of her before that. I had gone to Berkeley. We thought the SC kids were.
So you had a good opinion of her because she drank a lot?
I think that helped.
Oh.
I didn't drink, by the way. I drank some, but it wasn't so much the drinking. It was the fact that she was so open, probably because she had a few drinks, right? And then we spent a wonderful summer together. And then she went back to SC after summer, and she went for one semester. Then she came back for the winter break. And we went to Maui. I told her, you go meet my grandparents. So by that time it was
getting serious.
Yeah, I was getting serious. But I knew I had to go into the army yet, so it was going to be a while before we could get married. Took her to the top of Haleakala, and I think I was suffering from oxygen deprivation. That's what I told her. Anyway, I asked her if she would marry me. And she said yes. And then she went back, finished up her semester, and then moved over here. I was taking the bar. And then Southeast Asian wars were going on. So I joined the reserves. I was a big anti-war person. And then I had to do active duty training for 9-10 months. So we didn't get married until 3 years later. But it's been she's been a wonderful wife. She's been a better wife to me than I have been a husband to her. She's really terrific person. And then we got involved in the same stuff. I started working on nonprofit boards about 40 years ago. Came about because of, like in many things, because of relationships, right? You ask people for favors, then they call you up and say, we want you to sit on a board, and you go, you got to do it, kind of thing. Stanley Hong was part of the reason for that. Anyway, I started sitting on nonprofit boards, and one of the boards that I sat on and chaired for a long time was Child and Family Service. In those days, the board was made up primarily of the wives of Haole executives. So the midkiffs and the usual suspects were all there. And they were not good board members because they got tied to projects. They had favorites. And so when you did budgeting, it was just, but we needed a place for them to go where they could be supportive and at the same time. So I asked Lynn if she would start a guild of mostly women. I became the first member. It's called the Guild, the Child and Family Service Guild, where volunteers could get engaged with the agency without being on the board. It has since then raised millions of dollars for Child and Family Service and still very active.
Oh, you guys started that a long time ago. Wow.
A long time ago, 40 years ago. Part of the offshoot of that was the Philippines. We used to adopt children. Child and Family Service used to have an international adoption agency. And when Aquino took office, the adoption stopped. And the reason it was significant was because in those days in Asia, in the Asia Pacific Basin, you could get females, but you could not get males. Most of the cultures kept the males, they give you the females away, which was a big mistake. They were giving away the best part. Philippines was an exception. They were matriarchal. And so you could get boys out of the Philippines and you couldn't get girls. And anyway, when Aquino came to office, it stopped. And we sent a delegation there to find out why. And she said, well, you guys are not really helping the poorest of the poor. Why don't you guys come over and help us dealing with street children and the real poor?
So you were talking to the president?
Well, we were talking to her ministry. But she was kind of a motherly person. I mean, we did meet her. But the delegation came back. I was chair. And they said, what do you think? And I said, I think it's a good idea, but we don't know anything about the Philippines, but the fastest growing community here are the Filipinos. So maybe we can find a way of connecting because they're a hard group to connect with. And that started a project in Baguio, which is 200 miles north of Manila, that Lynn, who had done work with the Aloha Medical Mission before, somehow got engaged in. And 30 years later, it became the reason Consuelo Foundation started, was that project. It's still not only alive, it thrives. It's now a home for sexually abused girls. And so she's very much engaged in that. I was asked to be the chair ultimately of the Consuelo Foundation. And so we both have interests in the Philippines, and they're connected. Right? So anyway, so we do a lot of things together in that sense. Here too, I've had a great life. I mean, I have a great life. I don't have any regrets, or I've never been depressed. I have enough to keep us in. We're not rich, but we're comfortable, and that's all you need. Yeah. I think about when you're 81 years old, you start thinking about the end. Not so much how you're going to die, but not about whether you're going to die, because everybody knows you're going to die, but how you're going to die, and trying to figure out logistically what makes sense. I had tried, we live in a big house with apartments and cottages and whatnot, and I had been trying to convince Lynn that maybe we had to move into a smaller place. So we bought the house next door, tore it down, was going to build a small house there, until Katie and Chris came by and said, hey, we want to build a house there. So that foiled that. And then I came to the conclusion, after Lynn told me, after my many attempts to move, that I'm going to die in this house. I just want you to know that. So the question then becomes, okay, you're going to die in this house, but what happens if you die before I die? Well, I'm going to live in this house? So that's become now a kind of an issue of plan B. We have a cottage, so I could move in there. But then what are you going to do with the big house? I don't know. Then, because our kids have their own houses, so that's not likely. Katie thinks we ought to use it as a place where you can house young children and old people at the same time, which is kind of an interesting idea. So we just applied to Kahalanui.
And like 9 years later, when you get in,
Whatever. But it's sort of like, as I said, it's a plan B, right?
Yeah.
So we're in no rush.
15 or 16 years, you were one of the first ones on our radio. You were only ones on the TV. And then out of that batch so far, you're the only one back with me on this one so far. And I want to just appreciate you for that. You've always been supportive to me. You've always been a good mentor to me and helpful. Yeah. And I just want to thank you for
Somebody asked me once, one of the young lawyers asked me, they said, how do you get a mentor? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, how do you get somebody to be a mentor? So I thought about that. And I said, well, first thing you do is you go ask them. And they said, really? I said, and she said, does it work? I said, yeah, it usually works. Because if somebody comes and asks you for your advice, pretty soon you come to the conclusion that person must be brilliant. So you become a mentor, right? I think that's true. At least it was true in my case. I had a lot. I had more than I deserve in terms of mentors, but they were all helped in one way or the other.
I feel the same way.
So anyway, good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck to you.
If you resonate with Greater Good Radio, please join our community at www.greatergoodradio.com, where you can get access to exclusive content and offerings. Hope to see you soon.